Welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive. We are really thrilled to have you here with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for joining us.
Because, look, if you are listening to this right now, you are exactly the kind of person we build these deep dives for. Someone who is insanely curious.
Right, someone who really wants to peek behind the curtain of the daily news cycle.
Exactly. Someone who craves a thoroughly engaging synthesis without feeling, well, without feeling buried under a massive mountain of raw data.
Because there's a lot of data out there.
So much data. And our mission today is simple, but the scope of it is honestly massive. We are going to equip you with a completely different lens through which to view world events.
A totally new framework.
Right. We want to bypass all the daily noise, avoid the usual information overload, and hopefully deliver some serious paradigm-shifting aha moments for you.
And to accomplish that, we are looking at a truly fascinating stack of source materials today.
It really is.
What we have in front of us is a comprehensive series of transcripts from a highly intensive advanced Geo-Strategy class.
Yeah, and on the surface, if you were to just glance at the syllabus, the lectures in these sources might sound completely disconnected.
Oh, totally. I mean, one day, the lecturer is breaking down the extreme psychological profiling of elite special forces operatives.
Right.
The next day, they are exploring ancient Greek game theory.
And then suddenly the discussion pivots to artificial intelligence, predictive history, and this is wild, the deep, centuries-old religious roots driving American foreign policy.
It sounds all over the place, but as we synthesize these documents, a very clear, overarching, big-picture context emerges.
The overarching theme connecting all of these seemingly disparate topics is the life cycle of empires.
Exactly.
It is a profound structural analysis of how great powers rise to dominance, how they attempt to maintain their grip on global authority, and crucially, the specific mechanisms that inevitably lead to their decline.
The sources make a highly detailed, methodical argument here. They argue that specific structural forces, namely military hubris, crushing economic debt, and deep social fractures, are currently pushing the American empire toward unprecedented volatility.
And the text argues this volatility is manifesting both abroad, in places like the Middle East and Eastern Europe, and right back at home within domestic borders.
Now, before we unpack the mechanics of that argument, we need to establish a critical ground rule for this analysis.
Yes, this is so important.
This is absolutely vital for you, our listener, to keep in mind throughout this journey. The source material we are examining today contains highly charged, deeply provocative political opinions and geopolitical predictions.
Very charged.
It covers explosive topics across multiple sides of the political spectrum. We're talking about hyper-partisan perspectives on U.S. domestic politics and looming elections.
As well as incredibly tense international conflicts involving Israel, Iran, Gaza, Russia, and China.
So we want to make it unequivocally clear, we, as your hosts, are not taking sides.
We are not taking sides. We are not endorsing, validating, or condemning any of the political viewpoints, historical reinterpretations, or future predictions contained in these lectures.
Our goal here is strictly analytical. We are just guides to the material.
We are here to impartially unpack the fascinating theories and the specific geopolitical models presented by the lecturer in your sources.
The objective is simply to help you understand the internal logic of these arguments, how the source connects point A to point B to arrive at its conclusions.
And maintaining that objective distance allows us to examine these models critically, which is important because the frameworks presented in these transcripts challenge almost every conventional narrative presented in mainstream analysis.
Which brings us to the core hook of today's journey.
Right. What if the chaos you see in the world right now, the endless regional wars, the intense political polarization, the widespread economic anxiety, what if absolutely none of it is random?
What if there is a predictable, almost mathematical rhythm to the rise and fall of nations?
And what if artificial intelligence could eventually be utilized to predict the collapse of our own society based entirely on fundamental, unchanging human desires?
It is a staggering premise.
It really is.
To understand how the source believes an empire falls, the material argues we first have to deeply understand how that empire currently projects its power.
Right.
And how that specific method of power projection creates a fatal, blinding hubris.
And that requires us to start with a genuine military history mystery.
Let's dive into it.
The source texts outline that for literally thousands of years, military campaigns across the globe were governed by three traditional, practically unbreakable rules of warfare.
3 golden rules.
First, an army must mass its forces. The historical rule of thumb is that an attacking force needs at least a 3-to-1 numerical advantage over a defending enemy if they want to successfully hold territory in advance.
Basically, bring more guys than the other side.
Exactly. Second, a military force must avoid encirclement at all costs. Being surrounded means your fighting capacity is squeezed until it breaks.
Right.
And third, an army must relentlessly protect its supply lines. Logistics win wars. I mean, a tank without fuel is just a metal coffin.
Those are the foundational pillars of traditional symmetric warfare. The historical record overwhelmingly suggests that armies that violate those three rules are annihilated.
But the source text points us to a specific historical moment where those rules were intentionally discarded.
The year 2003?
2003, during the United States invasion of Iraq. According to the lecturer, the U.S. Pentagon, under the leadership of Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, threw thousands of years of military doctrine right out the window.
They introduced and executed a brand new theory of war, famously dubbed shock and awe.
And the raw numbers provided in the source are just staggering when you view them through a historical lens. The U.S. invaded Iraq with roughly 130,000 troops.
Right.
They were going up against a deeply entrenched 370,000-strong Iraqi army.
Which completely violates that first rule of massing forces we just talked about.
Completely violates it. The invading force was outmanned nearly 3-to-1. That's an exact inversion of traditional military logic.
And the conventional military brass in the Pentagon explicitly warned Rumsfeld that this was an exceptionally dangerous plan. Traditional generals advocated for deploying nearly 1 million soldiers.
1 million?
Yeah, to ensure secure supply lines, prevent any chance of encirclement, and properly occupy the country.
But Rumsfeld and his deputy, Paul Wolfowitz, fundamentally disagreed. They argued that the very nature of human warfare had evolved past the need for massive lumbering armies.
The framework they operated underviewed enemy militaries not as sweeping walls of manpower, but as hierarchical systems.
Like a biological body.
Exactly like a biological body, with a central nervous system and a head. The logic of shock and awe dictated that you don't need a massive million-man army to fight the entire body.
You only need a highly advanced surgical tool to sever the head, and the rest of the body will naturally collapse into paralysis.
And the mechanics of how they achieved the surgical decapitation rely on 3 specific pillars, according to the source.
Let's walk through those.
The first pillar is absolute air supremacy. This isn't just about having more planes. It is the ability to control the skies so totally that a single GPS-guided cluster bomb dropped from high altitude could eradicate an entire enemy armored division before they even knew they were being targeted.
Total dominance.
The second pillar is what the lecturer terms technological omniscience.
Right.
The invading force practically operated with a God's eye view of the battlefield. Utilizing an unprecedented network of satellites, high-altitude drones, and advanced signals intelligence, the U.S. military could see and hear virtually everything happening on the ground in real time.
The metaphorical fog of war, which had plagued commanders since the dawn of conflict, was supposedly lifted.
And the third pillar acts as the vital nervous system connecting that omniscient sky to the physical ground.
Special forces.
Special forces. These are elite, highly autonomous operatives infiltrating deep behind enemy lines, independently identifying high-value targets, and directing that overwhelming air power with pinpoint, devastating accuracy.
The outcome of the 2003 invasion is crucial to understand because it solidified this new mindset within the empire.
How fast was it again?
The initial invasion phase of the war in Iraq was concluded in exactly 3 weeks.
3 weeks.
3 weeks. The United States suffered fewer than 200 casualties during this period, and the source poignantly notes that a significant portion of those were actually tragic friendly fire accidents, not enemy action.
Wow.
It was a display of dominance so absolute that the U.S. military engaged in maneuvers known as thunder runs.
Explain those, because that's fascinating.
This involved American armored columns casually driving in loops around the capital city of Baghdad, completely exposed, simply to flex their impunity. They were demonstrating to the Iraqi leadership and the watching world that the enemy was entirely powerless to stop them.
While tactically brilliant in that specific moment, the geopolitical analysis in the source argues this precise flex of power bred what the lecturer defines as imperial hubris.
Hubris.
The military and political leadership of the empire internalized the belief that they had permanently hacked warfare. They began treating shock and awe as a universal formula, a plug-and-play strategy that could be successfully deployed against any adversary in any geography at any time.
But the lecturer forcefully argues that 2003 was not a universal formula. It was a massive, unrepeatable historical anomaly.
A total one-off.
Yes, the success of shock and awe relied on three highly specific geographical and historical circumstances.
What's the first one?
First, the geography of Iraq is primarily flat, open desert. A desert is the absolute ideal environment for maximizing air power, satellite surveillance, and the rapid mobility of special forces. There are very few places to hide a tank column in the open sand.
Right, you can't hide from a satellite in a desert.
Exactly. The second unique factor was the state of the enemy's defenses. Saddam Hussein possessed virtually no functional air defense network.
The source details how Saddam had learned a brutal lesson during the 1991 Gulf War. He realized his forces could not possibly compete with American air power.
So he didn't even try.
No, he didn't even attempt to rebuild a comprehensive anti-air defense network in the lead-up to 2003. His military focus and resource allocation were directed almost entirely inward, focused on suppressing domestic uprisings and maintaining his dictatorial grip on his own populace.
The third factor was the element of unprecedented surprise. No military had ever faced a synchronized attack of this nature before.
The source describes how Saddam Hussein was so thoroughly disoriented by small teams of special forces covertly destroying critical infrastructure in western Iraq that he completely misread the battlefield.
Right. He panicked.
Yeah.
Assuming the main invasion force was coming from a different direction, he diverted his elite Republican Guard units away from Baghdad,
essentially leaving the capital's front door wide open for those thunder runs.
The danger highlighted by the source is that the empire took a unique set of unrepeatable circumstances, achieved a stunning low-casualty victory, and mistakenly assumed their success was due to the infallible nature of their new military doctrine.
This brings us to a really fascinating pivot in the source material, analyzing the specific psychology of the soldiers required to maintain this new era of warfare.
Yes.
If an empire decides it is going to fight its wars utilizing shadow tactics, precise technological strikes, and small, highly elite units, rather than drafting massive armies of regular citizens, it requires a profoundly different type of human being to execute those orders.
The lecturer traces the origin of this psychological shift back to the deep institutional trauma of the Vietnam War.
Which was a very different kind of war.
Very different. During Vietnam, the military relied on a massive conscripted force of everyday citizens. This resulted in significant casualties spread across the broader population, which in turn sparked an overwhelming democratic backlash back home.
The widespread protests and the eventual publication of the Pentagon Papers demonstrated to the military establishment that relying on the consent of a fully informed democratic public was a massive liability for executing long-term imperial strategy.
The logic goes, if the general public sees thousands of body bags returning home on the evening news, they will use their voting power to demand an immediate end to the war, regardless of the geopolitical objectives.
Therefore, the source argues that shock and awe and the heavy reliance on special forces wasn't merely a tactical military evolution.
It was a deliberate political workaround.
Exactly. It was a strategy designed to divorce the violent maintenance of global power from the oversight and squeamishness of a democratic republic.
To achieve that divorce, you must build an enforcement mechanism out of individuals who are willing to operate entirely in the shadows. The source provides intense, almost incomprehensible examples of the filtering mechanisms used to select these individuals.
It's wild to read about. Consider the testing for the British Special Air Service, or SAS. Just the initial phase of their selection process involves forcing recruits to run the equivalent of 6 marathons over 5 consecutive days.
While navigating treacherous mountain terrain.
Right, all while carrying a backpack loaded with heavy bricks. And the reward for completing that physical torture is moving on to a phase where they must withstand days of simulated interrogation and torture.
The French Special Forces utilize a test that is equally extreme, but focuses heavily on psychological nerve. Recruits are required to stand completely still, wearing a protective vest, and hold a small clay disc over their own chest while their fellow operatives fire live ammunition at the disc.
The lecturer quotes a former operative to explain the rationale behind these terrifying tests. They aren't just testing physical endurance or marksmanship. They are psychological filtration systems designed to identify individuals who are fundamentally addicted to extreme risk.
The people who pass these tests possess a psychological profile that is distinctly removed from the average civilian. They are conditioned for extreme violence, total self-reliance, and operating outside the bounds of conventional rules.
The crux of the structural problem identified by the source is the sheer scale of this expansion.
The numbers are huge. The United States has expanded its special forces footprint from roughly 38,000 personnel in the year 2000 to over 73,000 highly trained operatives today.
The empire has constructed its primary enforcement arm out of an army of risk-addicted, highly independent individuals who operate largely unseen.
This creates a military apparatus that is supremely confident, historically blind to the geographical anomalies of its past successes, and heavily reliant on stealth, small unit tactics, and air power.
Which poses a terrifying hypothetical question for the empire. What happens when a military force, drunk on the hubris of a victory achieved in a flat desert against a defenseless enemy, attempts to deploy that exact same doctrine against a heavily fortified nation that is essentially a giant mountain fortress?
That geographic reality brings us directly into the mechanics of asymmetrical warfare and what the source identifies as the looming trap in the Middle East.
The texts argue that this specific brand of imperial hubris is guiding the United States toward a catastrophic, unwinnable conflict, using the current tensions involving the U.S., Israel, and Iran as the primary case study.
To ground this theory in modern events, the lecturer points to the recent escalation chain. The April 1st strike on the Iranian diplomatic compound in Damascus, Syria, which resulted in the deaths of several high-ranking Iranian military commanders.
Which prompted Iran's highly publicized retaliation, dubbed Operation True Promise, where they launched a massive wave of drones and ballistic missiles toward Israel.
The immediate takeaway pushed by mainstream geopolitical analysts was that this event proved absolute Western military supremacy, noting that the combined defense systems of Israel, the U.S., and regional allies successfully intercepted roughly 99% of the incoming projectiles.
However, the lecturer challenges you to view this exchange through the highly specific lens of asymmetrical warfare.
And the source provides a brilliant analogy to clarify how asymmetrical warfare functions. Imagine a combatant named Jack.
Jack.
Right. Jack is equipped with a heavy machine gun, state-of-the-art night vision, and impenetrable full-body armor. If you agree to fight Jack in an open, sunlit field, his technological and material advantages guarantee your immediate death.
Obviously.
But suppose you live in a dense, pitch-black ancient forest. You know every hidden route, every natural choke point, every shadow. If you can successfully bait Jack into stepping into your dark forest, his heavy armor suddenly becomes a cumbersome liability.
You don't engage his machine gun directly. You use hidden traps, deception, and the terrain itself against him.
Exactly. Asymmetrical warfare is the strategic art of an objectively inferior military power, forcing a vastly superior technological power to fight on terms that completely neutralize their advantages.
The source texts provide a chilling, real-world demonstration of this concept playing out against the American military.
The Millennium Challenge.
Right. In the year 2002, the U.S. military conducted an exhaustive, multi-million-dollar war game known as the Millennium Challenge. The simulation was explicitly designed to model a U.S. invasion of an unnamed Middle Eastern nation, widely understood to be a stand-in for Iran.
In this scenario, you had Team USA possessing the most powerful and technologically advanced virtual military force in human history, squaring off against Team Iran, commanded by a retired Marine Corps general tasked with thinking like an asymmetrical adversary.
In the very first phase of this massive simulation, the unthinkable happened. The Iranian team decimated the American forces.
The way they achieved this victory is a masterclass in the dark forest analogy.
The American fleet, operating under the hubris of shock and awe and technological dominance, moved massive billion-dollar aircraft carriers into the Persian Gulf. A conventional enemy would have launched their own navy, which the U.S. carriers would have instantly vaporized from miles away.
But instead, the commander of the Iranian simulation utilized a swarm tactic. He deployed thousands of cheap, retrofitted civilian speedboats packed with explosives. They operated like a swarm of angry hornets.
The state-of-the-art defense systems on the billion-dollar carriers were overwhelmed. They simply couldn't track and shoot down thousands of small, erratic targets simultaneously. The simulation calculated that the carriers were sunk, and thousands of virtual American sailors were lost within hours.
Furthermore, the Iranian commander completely neutralized the second pillar of shock and awe technological omniscience. Knowing that the U.S. military possessed the ability to intercept, decrypt, and locate any electronic radio signal, the Iranian team simply turned their radios off.
They issued orders to their frontline units using physical motorcycle couriers darting through traffic and relayed signals using rudimentary light flashes.
The multi-billion-dollar American Signals Intelligence Network was effectively blinded because they were listening for a frequency the enemy refused to broadcast on.
The response of the U.S. military umpires to this humiliating defeat is highlighted by the source as the ultimate proof of institutional inflexibility.
What did they do?
Rather than internalizing the devastating reality of the dark forest and adapting their strategy, the umpires literally paused the simulation.
Unbelievable.
They hit the reset button, magically refloated the sunken aircraft carriers, resurrected the dead sailors, and issued a strict new set of rules explicitly banning the Iranian team from utilizing asymmetrical swarm tactics or motorcycle couriers.
They essentially mandated that the inferior power must line up in the open field and fight Jack directly.
And unsurprisingly, under those newly imposed, highly artificial rules, the U.S. won the second round of the simulation.
The lecturer argues that this is the fatal flaw of aging empires.
Yeah.
They become so deeply wedded to their bureaucratic processes, their expensive technology, and their theoretical doctrines that they simply refuse to adapt to the messy, unpredictable reality of asymmetrical combat.
Which brings the analysis back to the harsh economic realities of Operation True Promise. When evaluating that massive drone strike on Israel, the source breaks down the financial mathematics, and the disparity is staggering.
Iran launched a massive swarm of relatively rudimentary drones. The estimated actual cost to Iran for manufacturing and launching that entire strike package using cheap drones as decoys to exhaust defense systems was somewhere in the neighborhood of $10 to $30 million.
Conversely, the cost for Israel, the United States, and their regional allies to successfully intercept that swarm utilizing highly advanced fighter jets, Patriot missile batteries, and sophisticated naval interceptors exceeded $1 billion for a single night of defense.
$1 billion versus maybe 30 million. That is the grinding, attritional math of asymmetrical warfare. The empire is forced to expend $1 billion of its finite resources to swat away an attack that costs the adversary practically nothing.
The lecture argues that Iranian leadership viewed True Promise as a massive strategic success, not because it leveled Israeli military bases, but because it forced the West into an economically unsustainable defensive posture, while perfectly executing the four essential goals of Iran's broader strategy matrix.
The source stresses that every geopolitical move Iran makes is heavily calculated to serve these four specific, long-term objectives in preparation for a larger conflict. Let's explore those goals.
Goal number one is the absolute necessity to unite their domestic population. The source acknowledges that the Iranian populace is deeply fractured, with significant internal resistance to the ruling theocracy.
However, the strategy relies on the premise that in the face of an existential external threat from the West, the population will rally around the flag. This isn't just theory. It is fueled by a very real, deeply ingrained historical trauma of Western interference.
The lecturer points specifically to the events of 1953 as the bedrock of this unifying grievance.
The historical context provided here is essential. British interests discovered massive oil reserves in Persia, leading to the formation of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which later became BP. The British structured the extraction deal so that the Iranians received a meager 16% of the profits from their own natural resources.
Oh, only 16%.
Yeah. When a democratically elected Iranian prime minister attempted to renegotiate a fairer 50-50 split, similar to deals happening elsewhere at the time, the British government, utilizing the newly formed American CIA, orchestrated a covert coup.
They overthrew the democratic government and installed the Shah, a monarch who maintained power through a brutal secret police force while ensuring cheap oil continued to flow west.
That specific historical memory is actively cultivated by the current regime as a unifying force, framing any Western military action not as liberation but as a return to colonial resource theft.
Goal number two focuses entirely on building resilient external alliances. The Iranian leadership understands they cannot sustain a direct, isolated war against the American empire.
Therefore, they actively cultivate the axis of resistance, a network of proxy militia groups across Lebanon, Yemen, and Iraq. More importantly, on a macro level, the source details how Iran is aggressively courting the major powers of an emerging multipolar world, specifically China and Russia.
The symbiotic nature of those alliances is fascinating. China is the world's manufacturing engine and desperately requires a secure, continuous flow of Middle Eastern oil to maintain its economic growth, making them highly motivated to keep Iran functional.
Right. And Russia, locked in a brutal conflict in Europe, actively benefits from the United States being distracted and bogged down by regional wars in the Middle East.
The lecturer suggests that Iran's highly calibrated military actions, like True Promise, serve partially as an audition. They are demonstrating their regional capabilities to Moscow in hopes of securing a Russian nuclear umbrella.
A strategic guarantee that if the U.S. were to launch a regime change invasion of Iran, Russia would threaten a nuclear response, effectively taking America's ultimate weapon of escalation off the board.
Goal number 3 is the battle for global opinion. The source argues Iran pursues this by carefully framing their military actions to contrast with the actions of their adversaries.
By executing strikes that are highly telegraphed, measured, and seemingly designed to avoid mass civilian casualties, such as giving advance warning before true promise, they attempt to project an image of a rational state actor seeking restrained justice.
They contrast the self-portrait against the massive civilian devastation occurring in Gaza, aiming to sway the sympathy of the global South and international institutions away from the U.S. and Israel.
And the final objective, goal number 4, is to systematically weaken the enemy from within by fostering internal dissent and exploiting existing fractures within the Western alliance.
The lecturer points to the massive polarizing protests on American college campuses regarding the Middle East, as well as the deep reluctance of European NATO allies to commit to offensive military action in the region.
Iran's asymmetrical strategy involves amplifying those domestic political crises, ensuring that if the empire chooses to fight, it does so with a deeply divided populace and a fractured coalition.
When you combine the mathematical reality of asymmetrical warfare with Iran's strategic matrix, the source presents a devastating hypothetical scenario. What would actually happen if the United States, driven by a combination of imperial hubris and intense domestic political pressure, decided to launch a traditional shock-and-awe ground invasion of Iran?
Imagine 100,000 highly trained American troops landing in the South, tasked with driving north to capture Tehran.
The lecturer argues this would be the ultimate terminal trap for the empire. Because unlike the flat, open deserts of Iraq, the geography of Iran is dominated by massive, rugged mountain ranges. It is a natural fortress.
In that mountainous terrain, the 3 ancient rules of war that the U.S. discarded in 2003 would reassert themselves with brutal consequence. First, the inability to mass forces becomes critical.
Deploying 100,000 troops is woefully insufficient to occupy a deeply hostile mountainous nation of nearly 90 million people. Traditional military math suggests you would need a drafted army of millions to even attempt a successful occupation.
Second, because armored columns are forced to navigate narrow mountain passes, they become instantly vulnerable to encirclement by asymmetrical fighters who utilize the high ground and intimately know the terrain.
And third, the logistical supply lines would be completely severed. You cannot safely drive convoys of highly flammable fuel trucks through mountain valleys controlled by insurgent forces utilizing hit-and-run tactics.
If the military attempts to bypass the roads and airdrop supplies, the airspace over those mountains would be saturated with cheap, shoulder-fired anti-aircraft rockets and swarms of attack drones, making helicopter resupply a suicide mission.
The source arrives at a deeply chilling conclusion regarding this hypothetical invasion. Those 100,000 elite American soldiers would not be conquerors marching on a capital. They would almost instantly become hostages of the terrain.
They would be trapped in the mountains, unable to safely advance without catastrophic casualties, and politically unable to retreat.
The lecturer draws a parallel to the year 415 BCE, during the Peloponnesian War, when the powerful Athenian Empire arrogantly decided to launch a massive invasion of Sicily.
The initial landing was a logistical disaster. But instead of cutting their losses, the Athenian leadership succumbed to the sunk cost fallacy. They believed that because they had already invested so much blood and treasure, retreating would be an unacceptable loss of imperial prestige.
So they stubbornly poured more ships, more resources, and more men into the meat grinder until their entire expeditionary force was annihilated, sparking the ultimate collapse of their empire.
The source argues that an invasion of Iran would trigger the exact same fatal psychological mechanism in Washington.
This exhaustive analysis of the military and geographical realities raises a profound question. If a ground invasion of Iran so clearly defies all traditional military logic, ignores the disastrous geographical realities, and walks blindly into a perfectly laid asymmetrical trap, why does the source text argue that the United States is seemingly marching inevitably toward that exact conflict?
And to answer that, the source dives into a deeply complex and highly sensitive area of analysis. The lecturer argues that the trajectory of an empire's foreign policy is rarely dictated solely by the cold, rational calculations of military generals.
Instead, it is heavily driven by the immense pressure of domestic, economic, and religious lobbying groups. The source explicitly identifies 3 primary forces actively pushing the United States toward a broader war in the Middle East.
The first force is fundamentally economic. The desperate need to protect the petrodollar system. To explain this simply, for decades, the global financial system has operated on an agreement that international oil trades are conducted almost exclusively in U.S. dollars.
Because every nation on Earth requires oil to function, every nation is forced to acquire and hold massive reserves of U.S. dollars. To hold those dollars productively, foreign nations buy U.S. Treasury bonds.
This continuous global demand for the dollar allows the United States government to print money and run up a staggering national debt without suffering the immediate hyperinflationary consequences that would destroy any other nation's economy.
Maintaining military dominance in the oil-rich Middle East is viewed as essential to enforcing this financial system, which essentially underwrites the American way of life.
The second force identified by the source involves geopolitical allies within the region, most notably Saudi Arabia, who view Iran's expanding influence as a direct existential threat to their own regional power and actively lobby for the U.S. to neutralize that threat on their behalf.
But it is the third force identified in the source text that is the most historically complex and deeply rooted, a highly influential domestic Israel lobby.
The lecturer is careful to point out that this lobby is not solely, or even primarily, comprised of Jewish advocacy groups like AIPAC. The sheer political mass of this lobby is generated by massive organizations of American Christian Zionists.
To explain why tens of millions of American Christians would actively lobby their government to pursue aggressive geopolitical conflict in the Middle East, the lecturer takes us on an expansive historical detour, tracing the bizarre and fascinating evolution of Christian theology over 2 millennia.
The source begins by examining the origins of early Christianity within the brutal hierarchy of the Roman Empire. In its inception, Christianity was a radically egalitarian, anti-authority movement that appealed almost exclusively to the most oppressed segments of society: slaves, destitute peasants, and marginalized outcasts.
The lecturer utilizes a compelling modern analogy describing this early faith as a free lottery ticket for the hopeless.
If you are a starving peasant with absolutely zero chance of social mobility during the Pax Romana, the theology of Christianity cost you nothing to adopt, but it promised the ultimate cosmic jackpot.
The core belief was that Jesus would literally return in the near future, violently overthrow the corrupt, wealthy elites of the Roman government, and establish a literal kingdom of heaven on earth where the last would be first and everyone would be equal.
But then, the source details an incredible historical irony that completely upended this theology. Fast forward a few centuries, and this revolutionary anti-government religion for the oppressed is unexpectedly adopted as the official state religion of the Roman Empire.
Suddenly, the church is no longer the persecuted rebellion. It is deeply intertwined with the supreme authority of the state.
This created a massive existential theological headache. You cannot effectively run a vast bureaucratic empire if your official religion preaches that God is going to arrive any day now to violently overthrow the government and redistribute all the wealth.
The source explains that this theological crisis was largely resolved by the highly influential philosopher Augustine. Augustine essentially performed a massive philosophical pivot.
He argued that the promised Second Coming and the literal 1,000-year era of peace weren't an impending violent overthrow of the current earthly powers. Instead, he argued that the church itself, operating in partnership with the state, was currently providing that spiritual kingdom of peace.
By doing this, Augustine effectively pushed the concept of the fiery apocalypse off into a vague, impossibly distant future, encouraging the populace to be patient, pay their taxes, and obey the present authority.
This theological consensus held the empire together for centuries, but the source explains that the Protestant Reformation completely shattered that consensus.
Once the printing press allowed everyday people to read and interpret the Bible for themselves outside the control of the central church, it led to a massive fragmentation of beliefs.
And one specific, highly detailed interpretation took incredibly deep root in the cultural soil of America, a theological framework known as dispensationalist premillennialism.
It is a dense academic term, but the source breaks down the mechanics of this belief system clearly. The premillennialism part refers to the belief that Jesus will literally return to Earth before the promised millennium of peace begins, meaning his return will be precipitated by global chaos, not gradual improvement.
But it is the dispensationalist aspect that has profound geopolitical implications today. This is the belief that the biblical texts lay out a very specific, step-by-step checklist, a series of dispensations or requirements that humanity must actively fulfill in order to trigger the return of Christ.
And what exactly is on that checklist according to this specific theological framework? The source outlines the requirements clearly. First, the Jewish people, who had been scattered globally for centuries, must physically return to the Holy Land and reestablish the sovereign nation of Israel.
Second, the historic Jewish temple must be physically rebuilt on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem.
And third, these events will culminate in a massive, apocalyptic global war centered in the Middle East against a malevolent geopolitical entity known as the Antichrist.
The lecturer is very careful to contextualize this. They note that many mainstream Christian denominations view this specific step-by-step interpretation as highly controversial, with critics arguing that attempting to force the hand of biblical prophecy through political lobbying is akin to arrogantly trying to manipulate God's timeline.
However, the source's primary argument is that regardless of theological debates, the millions of adherents to dispensationalist premillennialism are exceptionally well organized, massively funded, and wield deep structural influence over American foreign policy.
The source then connects this ancient theological evolution directly to modern economic anxiety, creating a powerful sociological synthesis.
The lecturer argues that under the current era of Pax Americana, this post-World War II era of relative global stability managed by the U.S. economic inequality within the empire has skyrocketed.
The wealthiest elite have captured the vast majority of the wealth generated, leaving millions of working-class and rural citizens feeling permanently economically trapped. They are drowning in generational debt, facing stagnant wages, and fundamentally believe that the secular American dream of upward mobility is entirely dead.
For an individual who feels economically hopeless and deeply alienated by modern secular culture, this specific apocalyptic religion is profoundly psychologically appealing.
It offers the ultimate hope, the promise of ultimate divine justice and a dramatic cosmic reset of a corrupt world system that has left them behind.
Therefore, the geopolitical result is that you have tens of millions of politically active citizens who do not just passively sit back and await the end times, they actively, fervently desire it.
The source argues this creates a massive, immovable voting bloc that passionately supports highly aggressive foreign policies, demands unconditional military aid to specific regional allies, and actively agitates for military confrontation in the Middle East.
They view these escalating conflicts not as horrific geopolitical disasters to be avoided, but as necessary, beautiful, prophetic milestones on the inevitable road to ultimate salvation.
Synthesizing this section, the source paints a deeply alarming picture. The United States is being slowly pushed toward an unwinnable, asymmetrical quagmire in the mountains of Iran by a lethal, compounding combination of unchecked military hubris, the desperate economic need to maintain the petrodollar, and a deep apocalyptic religious fervor that views war as a holy prerequisite.
It is a terrifying, irrational, cocktail-driving imperial policy.
It is, and meanwhile, as the source acutely points out, halfway across the world, foreign adversaries are watching this massive American overextension with great interest, strategic patience, and a plan.
Which brings us to a shift in perspective, exploring the grand chessboard and the Russian strategic imagination.
The lecturer argues that despite Western narratives framing Russian President Vladimir Putin as isolated or erratic, he is actually executing a highly disciplined grand strategy deliberately designed to systematically break the American empire.
And the model suggests he is doing this not through direct military confrontation, but by intentionally exploiting the three fatal flaws we've been discussing: overextension, economic debt, and civil discord.
Let's examine how the source models Putin's exploitation of these specific flaws. First, the flaw of overextension. By maintaining a constant simmering posture of threat across multiple global theaters, Putin effectively forces the United States to fight everywhere at once.
The U.S. military and economic apparatus is currently pouring massive resources into sustaining Ukraine, while simultaneously struggling to manage the explosive, expanding conflicts in the Middle East, all while desperately trying to pivot its naval assets to the Pacific to prepare for a potential conflict with China over Taiwan.
The source views this as classic imperial overreach, the empire exhausting itself by fighting geopolitical ghosts in every corner of the globe.
The second flaw Putin is targeting is the empire's crushing debt mountain. We discussed the exorbitant privilege of the U.S. dollar earlier. Because global trade is heavily conducted in dollars, the U.S. can absorb massive deficits.
However, the source outlines how Putin is actively and aggressively encouraging the BRICS Plus coalition, an economic bloc originally consisting of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, but now expanding to include major Middle Eastern oil producers to entirely bypass the U.S. financial system.
They are building alternative payment infrastructures to trade essential resources using gold or their own local currencies. If a critical mass of the global economy loses confidence in the dollar and stops buying U.S. debt to facilitate trade, the foundation of the empire's $35 trillion debt mountain structurally collapses.
The third flaw is the cultivation of civil discord, which we will explore deeply in a moment. But the core concept is that Putin understands that an overextended military combined with a collapsing economic foundation inevitably leads to angry, highly polarized citizens who no longer trust or believe in their own governing institutions.
The source applies this specific, attritional strategic lens directly to the ongoing war in Ukraine. According to the lecturer, the initial Western media consensus confidently predicted that the unprecedented weight of U.S. and European economic sanctions would rapidly crush the Russian economy, and that a united NATO would quickly force a Russian defeat.
Instead, the source argues the model proves the exact opposite has occurred.
The analysis points out that Russia successfully transitioned its domestic manufacturing into a highly resilient war economy. They effectively bypassed Western sanctions by simply rerouting their massive energy exports, trading oil and gas directly with hungry economies like China and India.
But the most crucial analytical pivot the source makes is regarding the duration of the war. The lecturer argues that Putin is no longer seeking a rapid, decisive military victory, nor is he genuinely interested in negotiating a swift peace settlement.
Why would a leader intentionally prolong a costly war? The source argues that a protracted, grinding conflict in Ukraine serves as a massive geopolitical black hole for NATO.
Every month the war continues. It systematically drains Western military stockpiles, forcing the U.S. into deeper debt to replace munitions.
Furthermore, the prolonged conflict acts as a wedge, creating massive economic friction within the NATO alliance itself. By cutting off the flow of cheap, reliable Russian natural gas, the war is effectively deindustrializing Germany, whose entire economic model relies on heavy manufacturing.
The model suggests Putin is intentionally bleeding the Western alliance slowly, letting the empire exhaust its resources and political will on the periphery.
This strategic patience requires a specific mindset. The source delves into how Putin is supposedly able to conceptualize and orchestrate this long game, suggesting it stems from a fundamental difference in how Russian leadership processes information compared to Western leadership.
The lecturer contrasts what they call Western British philosophy with traditional Russian philosophy.
The source paints these philosophical differences with broad conceptual strokes to illustrate a behavioral point. Western or British philosophy is described as highly narrow and deeply empirical and strictly logical. It is the philosophical foundation of modern Western academia, law, and corporate bureaucracy.
It demands hard evidence, step-by-step linear logic, and adherence to established processes. While this mindset is exceptionally efficient for managing a stable, functioning system, the source argues it inherently stifles intuition and bold, imaginative leaps.
The lecturer posits that a leader with the specific operational mindset of a Putin or a Stalin could never rise to the top of a modern Western bureaucracy because their defining strategic actions consistently defy standard empirical logic.
In contrast, the Russian philosophical tradition, according to the source texts, is categorized as broad, deeply mystical, and heavily reliant on intuition.
It values the ability to sense the underlying zeitgeist, the hidden spirit and emotional currents of the times, and having the imaginative capacity to leap to massive strategic conclusions without requiring a bureaucratic paper trail to justify the move.
To vividly illustrate this concept of the Russian strategic imagination, the source presents a truly mind-bending, highly controversial reanalysis of history. The lecturer focuses deeply on the actions of Joseph Stalin in the year 1941, during the build-up to Operation Barbarossa, the massive Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union.
Conventional empirical Western history generally teaches that Stalin was a deeply paranoid but ultimately foolish leader who was completely tricked by Adolf Hitler.
The standard narrative is that Stalin ignored repeated intelligence warnings that the Nazis were massing millions of troops at the border, and when the invasion finally began, he was so paralyzed by shock that he ordered his troops not to return fire, resulting in the near-total collapse of the Soviet army and the near loss of Moscow.
However, the lecturer completely flips this historical narrative using the principles of game theory. The source constructs an argument suggesting that Stalin didn't trust Hitler for a single second. Rather, Stalin possessed the intuitive imagination to deliberately play Hitler into attacking the Soviet Union first.
To understand this theory, the source asks us to look closely at the geopolitical game board in the late 1930s. There are essentially 6 major global powers, And virtually all of them possess a deep, existential hatred for the Soviet Union.
The United States and the United Kingdom are terrified of global communism spreading among their working classes during the depths of the Great Depression. The Japanese Empire despises communism and actively covets the vast oil and mineral resources of the Soviet Far East.
And Nazi Germany, of course, hates communism fundamentally on an ideological level.
The lecturer poses a critical game theory scenario. What happens if the Soviet Union, which at the time was a largely agrarian, industrially backward nation still recovering from internal purges, decides to aggressively launch a preemptive strike against Germany?
The source argues the outcome would be absolute suicide. The entire capitalist and fascist world would immediately unite their forces to crush the Soviet aggressor.
The UK, France, the US, and Japan would all likely form a coalition of convenience with Germany to violently partition the Soviet Union and extinguish the communist threat from the globe forever.
Therefore, Stalin is faced with an impossible strategic dilemma. How does a technologically backward, universally despised nation survive in a world where every major power fundamentally wants to destroy it?
The lecturer outlines the brilliant, counterintuitive leap Stalin supposedly made. He intuitively realized the Soviet Union desperately needed two things to survive the coming century: massive, rapid industrialization and total, unbreakable national unity.
And he knew the Soviet system could not generate either of those things on its own.
So according to this game theory model, Stalin decided to play the role of the naive, trusting sheep in order to bait the fascist wolf. He intentionally engaged in a highly public charade.
He signed the non-aggression pact with Hitler, seemingly ignored his own intelligence agencies, and publicly acted like a fool who believed peace was secure. He practically left the front door of his nation unlocked, inviting the invasion.
He deliberately baited the trap, and when Hitler's massive ego and ideological hatred couldn't resist the seemingly easy target, and he launched Operation Barbarossa, inflicting catastrophic damage on the Soviet military, the entire geopolitical calculus of the globe flipped in an instant.
It flipped because suddenly, the strategic reality changed entirely. Germany was now on the verge of capturing the vast agricultural and mineral resources of the Soviet Union.
If Hitler was allowed to successfully combine the unparalleled efficiency of German engineering with the infinite natural resources of the Russian landmass, he would possess the material capacity to unequivocally conquer the world.
The leadership in the United States and the United Kingdom realized immediately that they could not possibly let that happen.
And this is where the source delivers the staggering historical numbers that prove the efficacy of the strategy. What did the capitalist United States do to save the communist regime they despised?
Through the Lend-Lease program, the U.S. shipped the Soviet Union a mind-boggling $200 billion worth of free industrial and military aid. We are talking about supplying one-third of all the explosives used by the Red Army, half of all their combat aircraft, over 13,000 highly advanced tanks, entire modern railroad systems, massive amounts of food, and cutting-edge radio technology.
The takeaway from this historical reframing is profound. By intentionally letting Hitler attack first, and willingly absorbing a catastrophic, almost fatal initial hit, the source argues Stalin intuitively forced his greatest capitalist enemies to foot the bill for the complete industrialization of his country.
He forced the West to transform the Soviet Union from an agrarian backwater into a globally dominant nuclear-armed superpower, while simultaneously using the horror of the Nazi invasion to unite his fractured populace in a desperate patriotic war for survival.
The framework provided here suggests that the nation that appears to be losing might actually be brilliantly baiting a trap.
It is a deeply cynical, purely analytical rereading of history, but it perfectly encapsulates the concept of the Russian strategic imagination as defined by the source. Possessing the telepathic intuition to grasp the hidden emotional dynamics of a massive global conflict, and orchestrating a scenario where your enemies inadvertently expend their own resources to build your empire for you.
And the lecturer's core argument is that Vladimir Putin is operating with that exact same intuitive baiting strategy today. He is bleeding the American empire by encouraging it to destroy itself through arrogant overextension and insurmountable debt.
Which is a deeply unsettling thought, because if foreign adversaries are successfully stretching the American empire to its absolute breaking point abroad, we have to look at what is happening to the social fabric back home. The pressure has to go somewhere.
That brings us to the darkest, most volatile prediction contained in the source material: the collapse of narratives and the looming threat of a second American Civil War.
We have thoroughly analyzed the external pressures of overextension and debt. Now the source turns its analytical lens inward, examining the third pillar of imperial collapse, internal structural fracture.
The lecturer meticulously models a scenario where the United States, buckling under these compounding pressures, descends into a chaotic, highly fragmented period of domestic violence.
To understand how the source believes this is possible, the lecturer first lays out the foundational elements that make extreme violence a structural reality in America. First, the text highlights the sheer, unprecedented volume of weaponry embedded within the civilian population.
The lecturer notes there are an estimated 434 million privately owned firearms in the U.S., significantly more guns than there are human beings.
Second, the source points to a deeply ingrained cultural comfort with violence, symbolized metaphorically by the massive religious popularity of American football, a sport built entirely on physical dominance that routinely causes severe traumatic brain injuries to its participants.
Third, the source argues there is a strong historical precedent in America for resolving fundamental political and economic disputes through massive bloodshed.
To illustrate this precedent, the source provides a highly cynical, structurally focused rereading of the First American Civil War in 1861. The lecturer argues that, contrary to simplified modern narratives, the initial outbreak of the war was not primarily a moral crusade by the North to abolish the evil of slavery.
The text quotes Abraham Lincoln himself, who explicitly stated early in his presidency that his primary goal was to save the Union, and if he could achieve that without freeing a single slave, he would gladly do so.
Instead of a purely moral conflict, the source models the 1861 Civil War as fundamentally an irreconcilable economic and political power struggle between two competing systems.
You had the rapidly industrializing wealthy North clashing against the stagnant agricultural slave labor economy of the South. The flashpoint wasn't just morality, it was the expansion of political power into the newly forming Western states.
When Abraham Lincoln was elected without a single Southern electoral vote, representing a long-term existential threat to the South's economic model and their political parity in the Senate, the South seceded to protect their wealth.
The North then invaded primarily to maintain federal authority and preserve the economic integrity of the empire.
The core lesson the source extracts from 1861 is that when fundamental underlying power structures in America are genuinely threatened, the historical default response of the system is extreme, uncompromising violence.
Applying that historical logic to the present, the source argues a modern version of this violence is increasingly imminent because three specific pillars of societal stability are currently collapsing simultaneously. Let's unpack these structural failures.
The first is over-militarization. We already noted the 434 million private firearms, but the source focuses heavily on the militarization of domestic law enforcement. Over the past 2 decades, small-town police departments have been heavily equipped with military-grade armored vehicles, advanced tactical gear, and high-caliber weaponry originally designed for overseas combat zones.
The visual language of domestic policing has become indistinguishable from an occupying army.
Furthermore, the source circles back to those 73,000 Special Forces operatives we discussed earlier. In a scenario of severe domestic unrest, the source views this massive pool of highly trained individuals as a critical wildcard.
You have tens of thousands of veterans who are psychologically conditioned for extreme violence, experts in covert operations, and asymmetrical insurgency, essentially acting as independent, highly capable nodes within the civilian population.
The lecturer points out that if a domestic conflict breaks out, it would only take a tiny fraction of a group with the capabilities of Delta Force deciding to take a political side to completely destabilize regional governments or cripple vital infrastructure.
The second pillar of collapse identified by the source is the breakdown of unifying narratives. Every functioning society requires shared stories, myths that bind the population together and provide a sense of shared purpose.
The most prominent of these in the U.S. is the American dream. The core belief that if an individual works hard and follows the rules of the system, they will inevitably achieve prosperity and upward mobility.
The source argues that this central narrative has fundamentally died for younger generations. The text attributes this death to a transition into a rentier economy.
Think about a rentier economy like this. Instead of the wealthiest individuals making their money by innovating, building new factories, or creating tangible value, they make their vast fortunes simply by owning the underlying assets, the land, the housing, the digital platforms, the patents, and charging everyone else an exorbitant rent just to exist and participate in society.
Because of this structural shift, combined with crushing student debt and wildly unaffordable housing, younger generations simply no longer believe the myth of upward mobility. The shared dream of prosperity has been replaced by a shared nightmare of simply trying to survive without falling into bankruptcy.
When the population no longer believes the system offers them a future, their loyalty to that system evaporates.
Coupled with the death of the American dream is the collapse of the narrative of liberalism. The source uses this term in its classical philosophical sense, the foundational belief that despite profound ideological differences, citizens can utilize free speech, open debate, and establish democratic processes to reach functional compromises.
The lecturer argues that modern political polarization, heavily fueled by algorithmic media and culture wars, has become so absolute that opposing political factions no longer view each other as fellow citizens with differing opinions. They view each other as literal, existential enemies who must be completely destroyed.
If a population fundamentally believes that their political opponents are inherently evil and cannot be reasoned with, the philosophy of liberalism is dead, and the only logical remaining recourse for resolving disputes is physical force.
Which leads directly into the third collapsing pillar, the total breakdown of institutions. A society can survive polarization if it trusts the referees, but the source argues there is absolute zero trust left in any conflict resolution mechanism.
The federal government is widely viewed as a corrupt oligarchy. The mainstream media is dismissed by large swaths of the public as a partisan propaganda machine. The military establishment is viewed with deep suspicion following the prolonged failures and lack of accountability regarding Iraq and Afghanistan.
Universities, once respected arbiters of truth, are caught in endless culture wars. Even the fundamental institutions of science and medicine suffered a catastrophic loss of public credibility during the deeply politicized handling of the COVID-19 pandemic.
And most dangerously, the justice system, the ultimate referee, is increasingly viewed by massive segments of the population not as blind justice, but as a weaponized political tool used by elites to punish their enemies.
The sociological formula the source presents is terrifying. When you combine a heavily over-militarized society, strip away the unifying narratives that give people hope, and completely destroy public faith in the institutions designed to peacefully resolve conflicts, the structural conditions for a civil war are perfectly set. The powder keg is full. It only requires a specific catalyst to ignite.
And the source material points to a highly specific looming catalyst, a contested U.S. presidential election involving Donald Trump. Again, listener, we are impartially unpacking the geopolitical model presented in the text.
The lecturer does not analyze Trump merely as a traditional politician, but rather as a unique historical cultural phenomenon that perfectly embodies and inflames all of the nation's underlying fractures.
The source describes a psychological phenomenon within the establishment that it terms Trump derangement syndrome. Because Trump is viewed by the entrenched political, cultural, and media elites as a manifestation of absolutely everything they despise, an unpolished, disruptive outsider who loudly rejects their established norms and values, their hatred for him becomes absolute and blinding.
The source argues that this blinding hatred causes the elite to make catastrophic strategic errors. In their desperate, all-consuming attempts to legally and politically destroy Trump, the elites end up destroying the credibility of their own institutions.
By utilizing the media, the intelligence agencies, and the judicial system in ways that are widely perceived by the public as blatantly partisan attempts to stop him, the establishment inadvertently validates Trump's core underlying message to his base, that the entire system is deeply corrupt, rigged, and explicitly out to destroy them.
This dynamic transforms Trump in the eyes of his supporters from a flawed politician into a persecuted, almost messianic figure fighting a corrupt deep state.
So, how does the source model this dynamic sparking a physical conflict? The lecturer outlines a highly speculative, cascading scenario. Imagine a scenario where Donald Trump is successfully reelected. The source theorizes that his primary operational goal upon taking office will be absolute self-preservation, consolidating power to avoid future prosecution by his political enemies.
However, to effectively secure his grip on the apparatus of the state, he desperately needs the backing of the entrenched power structures. The intelligence community, the military and industrial complex, and the powerful foreign policy lobbies we discussed earlier.
And how does the model suggest he secures that vital institutional backing? By giving those powerful lobbies exactly the war they have been demanding.
The source theorizes a scenario where a re-elected Trump might appoint a fiercely hawkish, pro-war vice president or cabinet someone in the mold of a Nikki Haley, and officially initiate the long-desired massive military conflict with Iran.
This singular action would instantly satisfy the demands of the imperial military complex and the apocalyptic religious lobbies, temporarily securing his institutional power base.
However, the source argues this action would instantly ignite an uncontrollable domestic firestorm, initiating a wildly unpopular massive new war in the Middle East, ordered by a deeply polarizing president whom half the country views as illegitimate, would trigger mass protests and riots that would completely dwarf the unrest seen in recent years.
The model suggests the federal government would attempt to violently suppress these protests, which would rapidly escalate the situation into widespread factional violence. You'd see armed groups taking to the streets, neighbors turning against neighbors based purely on political and cultural affiliation.
The lecture's predictions escalate into a scenario of total systemic fracture. They envision powerful state or city governments outright refusing federal orders, potentially leading to formal secessions, with economic powerhouses like California or New York declaring de facto independence from a federal government they view as a rogue regime.
And most chillingly, connecting back to the military analysis, the source suggests that in this environment of total chaotic breakdown, the military itself, specifically those highly trained independent special forces units, might fracture along ideological lines.
If elite units take sides in the domestic political conflict, the result wouldn't be the orderly regional lines of infantry seen in 1861. It would be a nightmare scenario of sophisticated insurgencies, targeted assassinations of political leaders, and potential attempted coups led by rogue military factions.
The model predicts a decentralized, hyper-violent period of chaos spanning decades, ultimately resulting in a permanently fragmented, deeply isolationist, and highly extreme iteration of the former American empire.
Let's take a deep breath here. The material we have covered thus far is incredibly heavy, dense, and undeniably bleak. We have traced a logical path from arrogant military doctrines implemented in the desert to unwinnable traps in the Middle East, manipulated by patient foreign adversaries and zealous domestic lobbies, leading straight into a catastrophic model of domestic collapse.
It feels like we are meticulously analyzing the blueprints of a slow-motion train wreck.
But, fascinatingly, the source material actually executes a massive pivot in its final section. It transitions from the grim darkness of geopolitical collapse to a strange, almost science fiction-infused vision of hope, rooted deeply in the potential of future technology and the fundamental nature of the human soul. Let's explore this final concept: psychohistory, artificial intelligence, and human eudaimonia.
In the final lecture provided in the transcripts, the source completely shifts its focus to the ultimate, overarching question of this entire study. If we can use historical analysis to perfectly understand these destructive cycles of imperial rise and fall, can we eventually use technology to predict them mathematically and, more importantly, intervene to stop them?
To introduce this concept, the lecturer draws upon classic science fiction, specifically the legendary author Isaac Asimov and his seminal Foundation series. In those novels, a brilliant mathematician develops a fictional scientific discipline called psychohistory.
This discipline uses unimaginably complex mathematics and probability to accurately predict the behavior of massive populations over thousands of years.
The protagonist's goal is to mathematically map out the inevitable, impending fall of a massive galactic empire and use that predictive knowledge to subtly manipulate events, thereby shortening the ensuing Dark Ages from 20,000 years down to just a single millennium.
It sounds like pure, entertaining sci-fi, but the source explicitly connects Asimov's fiction to modern, highly serious, real-world academic disciplines. The lecturer points to the work of Peter Turchin, a quantitative historian who founded a modern field of study called cliodynamics.
Cliodynamics is the actual, literal attempt to apply mathematical modeling and statistical analysis to the broad dynamics of human history.
Turchin utilized supercomputers to analyze the rise and fall of hundreds of different historical societies across the globe. By crunching the data, he discovered a highly recurring mathematical pattern that acts as a leading indicator for societal collapse. He termed this specific mathematical phenomenon the overproduction of the elite.
The theory of the overproduction of the elite is brilliant in its simplicity. It posits that societies do not typically collapse primarily because of sudden outside invasions, natural disasters, or bad weather. They collapse from within, specifically when the system produces too many rich, highly educated, highly ambitious people who are all ruthlessly competing for a strictly finite amount of political and economic power.
The lecturer provides a great analogy to explain this. Political and economic power at the very top of a society is a zero-sum game. There is a hard mathematical limit. There can only be one president. There are only 100 senators. There is only one CEO of a major corporation.
As a society experiences a long period of peace and prosperity, like the Pax Americana, it naturally generates more wealth, builds more universities, and consequently creates a massive swelling class of elites.
You end up with tens of thousands of highly educated, ambitious individuals who all feel entitled to a position of significant power. But when the sheer number of these elites vastly exceeds the tiny number of available positions of power, the system breaks.
The frustrated elites who are locked out of power don't just accept their fate, they become deeply resentful, and they use their wealth, education, and influence to actively organize the lower classes and tear down the system that denied them their perceived rightful place.
The source provides a vivid historical example of this mathematical principle in action. Imperial China and its famously brutal civil service examination system. For centuries, the Chinese Empire operated a system where thousands of highly educated men studied their entire lives to take an incredibly difficult exam, competing for only a handful of prestigious, powerful government posts.
What happens to the brilliant, fiercely ambitious men who dedicate their lives to the system but mathematically fail to secure a position? They become the most dangerous element in society.
The lecturer specifically points to a historical figure named Hong Xiuquan. He was a brilliant scholar who repeatedly failed the imperial civil service exam, effectively locking him out of the elite power structure.
Fueled by his immense frustration, a deep sense of alienation, and a highly unique personal reinterpretation of Christian tracts he had acquired, he declared himself the younger brother of Jesus Christ.
He utilized his education and charisma to organize the rural poor and launch the Taiping Rebellion against the ruling Qing dynasty. This rebellion, sparked by a frustrated elite denied a position of power, resulted in one of the absolute bloodiest conflicts in all of human history, resulting in tens of millions of deaths.
Frustrated elites, mathematically, destroy the society that denies them agency.
Clea dynamics provides a proven mathematical pattern for looking backward at history and understanding why empires fell. But the source asks a much more ambitious question. What if we apply this logic forward? How do we build a real functional version of Asimov's psychohistory?
The lecturer argues that humanity now possesses the technological tool required to achieve this: artificial intelligence.
However, the source is exceptionally careful to clearly define what AI actually is, actively stripping away the magical sci-fi mystique portrayed in movies. The lecturer stresses that modern AI is not some self-aware, conscious robot brain plotting to take over the world. The accurate technical term is supervised machine learning.
To function effectively, supervised machine learning requires three very specific, highly structured components. First, it needs incredibly clear, quantifiable outputs. The programmers must define exactly what specific result they are trying to optimize for.
Second, the system requires massive, unimaginable amounts of clean, accurately labeled historical data to learn from.
And third, it requires a functional algorithmic structure that the computer can run millions of rapid iterations through, refining its accuracy with each cycle.
To illustrate how this actually works, the source uses the development of facial recognition technology. When an AI scans a crowd and identifies a specific person, the computer does not know it is looking at a human face. It has no concept of a face.
What happened is that human programmers created a highly complex mathematical model of facial topology, measuring the exact distance between the pupils, the angle of the cheekbones, the depth of the nose.
They then fed the computer billions of labeled images of human faces, constantly telling the machine when it successfully identified a match based on the math, and correcting it when it failed. Through infinite cycles of iteration and feedback, the machine aggressively refines its mathematical algorithm until its predictive capability becomes flawlessly accurate.
But the lecturer also highlights the inherent, fatal flaw in all current AI models, a concept known in programming as the edge case. The edge case represents the unpredictable, highly irrational human element that defies mathematical logic.
The source uses the ongoing, massively funded quest to develop fully autonomous self-driving cars to explain this flaw. An AI system can absolutely learn to perfectly navigate complex traffic rules, adjust instantly for severe weather conditions, and accurately predict the walking patterns of pedestrians.
But the AI can never, ever mathematically account for the edge case. A deeply irrational human being who, out of pure spite, anger, or suicidal ideation, intentionally decide they want to crash their vehicle directly into the self-driving car.
Artificial intelligence, built on logic and efficiency, cannot predict or optimize for irrational human malice or unpredictable emotional behavior.
Which brings us to the ultimate profound challenge of creating a geopolitical AI, a true psychohistory model capable of predicting the collapse of empires. If you are going to mathematically model and predict the future trajectory of human society, you cannot simply input cold, hard data like economic GDP, grain yields, or troop numbers.
To make the model accurate, you have to find a way to mathematically model the fundamental, unchanging desires of the human heart.
And what exactly are those fundamental human desires? To answer that, the source reaches past modern science and links back to the philosophy of the ancient Greeks and the profound poetry of Dante.
The lecturer argues that beneath all the superficial layers of culture, technology, and geography, every single human being fundamentally seeks only three core things: the capacity to love, the freedom to create, and the opportunity to grow.
When a society's overarching structure, its government, its economic system, its culture, is designed to allow individuals the freedom and agency to fulfill those three basic needs, you achieve what the ancient Greeks defined as eudaimonia, a state of true, deep human flourishing and societal stability.
But the corollary is equally true and mathematically predictable. If an imperial system becomes rigid and corrupt, transforming into a mechanism solely designed for a tiny elite to monopolize all wealth and power, it inherently represses the masses.
It denies the average citizen the economic and political agency required to love securely, create freely, and grow prosperously. When eudaimonia is structurally repressed, the human heart will inevitably, violently rebel.
If the capacity for love is continually repressed by trauma and poverty, it ferments and turns to deep societal hate. If the natural urge to create and build a life is stifled by a rentier economy, it twists and turns into the urge to destroy the system.
The source's ultimate argument is that to successfully build a predictive geopolitical AI, programmers must find a way to encode this fundamental philosophical truth into the core algorithmic structure. A mathematical model must recognize that a society that systematically represses eudaimonia will mathematically, predictably, and inevitably collapse under the weight of its own frustrated human energy.
But this raises a fascinating contradiction within the source material. If human history operates on these vast, predictable mathematical cycles of human desire and elite overproduction, how does the model explain the great men of history?
The ultimate edge cases. The individuals who seemingly step completely out of the predictable flow of time and use their sheer will to violently bend the trajectory of the universe.
Yes. How do you mathematically code an algorithm to account for the sudden emergence of a completely anomalous genius? How do you predict a Homer who redefines literature or a Dante who reshapes theology?
Or, as the source repeatedly suggests, how do you mathematically model a modern strategic anomaly like Vladimir Putin, who operates on intuition rather than empirical logic?
The lecturer describes these rare world historic figures almost as telepaths. They use this term not in a science fiction sense of moving physical objects with their minds, but to describe individuals who possess an unquantifiable, deep, intuitive genius to read the emotional mood of humanity.
These telepaths have the innate ability to sense the deepest unspoken frustrations and desires of the masses, and the ruthless imagination required to manipulate those massive emotional currents to completely alter the trajectory of civilization.
By definition, you cannot write code to predict a telepath. They are the edge cases that break the mathematical model of history. So, how can psychohistory possibly work if a single, unpredictable genius can shatter the algorithm?
To resolve this flaw, the source once again looks back to Asimov's science fiction for the structural answer. In the Foundation series, to ensure the math works, the founder creates a second foundation.
The lesson is that humanity cannot simply surrender its future to the cold, unfeeling calculations of an AI algorithm. To make psychohistory work, you must build a dedicated, highly transparent institution comprised of deeply empathetic, heavily educated human experts.
The sole job of this second foundation is to constantly, vigilantly observe the society, identify the emergence of those unpredictable edge cases, the great men, the sudden shifts in philosophy, the intuitive leaps of adversaries, and manually, carefully adjust the parameters of the AI model to account for them.
Psychohistory, in this final vision, isn't about humanity surrendering its agency to a machine. It is about humanity utilizing advanced technology as a tool to actively, consciously guide its own evolution toward a more stable, flourishing future.
We have covered an absolutely immense amount of analytical ground today. Let's briefly retrace the massive journey we've taken through these sources. We started by examining the sheer, blinding imperial hubris born from the shock and awe military doctrine in 2003, which bred an overconfident empire overly reliant on the shadowy violence of special forces.
We saw how that exact geographical overconfidence is currently being lured into a potentially catastrophic, unwinnable asymmetrical trap in the mountain fortresses of Iran.
From there, we examine the deep underlying domestic forces pushing relentlessly for that conflict. We analyze the harsh economic necessity of maintaining the petrodollar and unpack the profound apocalyptic influence of Christian Zionism, viewing modern geopolitics through the specific lens of ancient biblical prophecy.
We then analyzed the grand chessboard, exploring how foreign adversaries are actively exploiting the empire's hubris. We detailed how the Russian strategic imagination, utilizing the intuitive baiting tactics seen with Stalin in 1941, is intentionally draining Western resources and exacerbating debt in places like Ukraine.
We stared directly into the abyss of the source's darkest, most violent prediction. A looming Second American Civil War, structurally sparked by the mathematical overproduction of elites, the collapse of unifying national narratives, an over-militarized society, and the intense, blinding political polarization surrounding figures like Donald Trump.
And finally, we explored the ambitious theoretical attempt to map all of this chaos mathematically. We examined the concepts of cryodynamics and psychohistory, detailing the attempt to use supervised machine learning to model the fundamental human desire for eudaimonia, all in hopes of predicting and preventing future societal collapses.
It is a sweeping, comprehensive, and deeply challenging model of how the mechanics of the world actually operate, according strictly to the framework provided in the sources.
So as we wrap up this intense deep dive, I want to turn the focus directly back to you, the listener. I want to ask you to deeply reflect on your own specific place within this massive, grinding historical machine.
As you look around your daily life, your workplace, your local community, are you personally feeling the intense pressure of the overproduction of elites? Do you feel that fierce, exhausting competition for a rapidly shrinking slice of the economic pie?
Are you, like the millions of people described in these lectures, desperately craving structure, deep meaning, and true purpose in an era where the old, comforting narratives seem to be violently falling apart?
It is a profound, deeply personal question to consider. And I want to leave you with a final thought, a concept inspired directly by the source material, but expanding upon its core philosophical premise.
If the models are correct, and empires truly fall because they become hopelessly inflexible, rigidly bureaucratic, and ultimately repress the fundamental human desire to love, create, and grow, then perhaps the ultimate act of rebellion in our modern time isn't physical violence.
It isn't engaging in the endless, toxic polarization or fighting the daily culture wars. The ultimate act of shaping the future, the process of building your own personal psychohistory, is to fiercely, stubbornly protect your own individual capacity to learn and to create.
In an era defined by profound societal burnout and institutional collapse, refusing to surrender your innate curiosity and your deep empathy is a genuinely revolutionary act.
The future is not a predetermined mathematical catastrophe that you must simply sit back and wait for. It is something you possess the agency to actively imagine and intentionally build every single day.
Thank you so much for taking this incredibly intense, demanding, and rewarding deep dive with us today.
We sincerely hope we have provided you with a powerful new set of analytical tools to process the world around you. Tomorrow, when you look at the news cycle, we challenge you to look far past the surface-level headlines. Question the underlying narratives being presented and consider the deep, structural, historical currents moving silently beneath the surface. Stay curious, stay thoughtful, and keep learning.